I paid for my parents to fly out to see me for the first time in 4 years. I booked 2 round-trip tickets, arranged a rental car so they wouldn't have to depend on anyone, and filled my kitchen with groceries I knew they would recognize. It felt easier to handle it all myself than to coordinate anything back and forth. My name is Sophia Taylor. I'm 28 years old. I live in Charleston, South Carolina, where I manage restoration projects for older hotels that need careful work to stay standing. Most of my days are structured around timelines, budgets, and small decisions that keep things from falling apart. I approached this visit the same way, quietly making sure everything was in place before they arrived. They told me they would split their time between my place and my brother's. That part mattered to me more than I admitted. It sounded balanced, and I held on to that. Their flight landed on a Tuesday afternoon. I texted to make sure they got the rental car without any issues, and my mother replied that everything was fine and that they were heading to my brother's house first to settle in. She added that it would be easier with the kids and the extra space. I read the message twice before responding, then told her to let me know what time they wanted to come by later. I set the table that evening out of habit. 4 plates, napkins folded the way my mother used to insist on when I was younger, and a simple meal that didn't require reheating. I left the kitchen light on and kept my phone nearby, expecting it to ring at any point. It didn't. After a while, I checked my messages again. There was nothing new, just the earlier note about staying at my brother's house. I waited longer than I needed to before putting the food away, mostly because I had already decided how the evening was supposed to go. I told myself it was just travel fatigue, which made sense if I didn't look too closely at it. The first night, I told myself they were tired. By the third night, I knew better. By the next morning, the distance started to feel different. 30 minutes isn't far in Charleston, not when people drive farther than that for work without thinking about it. But something about it kept settling in the wrong place. They weren't across the country anymore. They were close enough to come over without planning, and still they didn't. My mother called mid-morning, her voice light in a way that suggested everything was already decided. She said they had slept well, that my brother's house was busy with the kids, and that it made sense to stay there for now because it was easier on everyone. I listened without interrupting, noticing how she spoke as if I had already agreed. "I can come by later," she added, almost as an afterthought. I said I could have dinner ready at my place instead. Something simple, nothing that would require them to stay long. There was a brief pause on the line, just enough to feel it. "We'll see how the day goes," she said, soft enough that it sounded like consideration, but not firm enough to mean anything. After the call ended, I turned off the stove and left the food where it was, looking at the counter where I had already started prepping for the evening. I adjusted a few things that didn't need adjusting, then checked my phone again out of habit. They didn't ask what time worked for me. They didn't ask what I had planned. I still cooked that night, keeping everything simple, telling myself that flexibility was reasonable when people were visiting. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I noticed I was the only one adjusting. They canceled dinner just before 6, close enough to the time that everything was already done. My phone buzzed while I was standing at the stove, and for a second I thought they were on their way. Instead, it was a short message from my mother saying the kids had run late and that they would try another night. I didn't answer right away. I turned off the heat, covered the food, and stood there longer than I needed to, trying to decide whether to let it go or not. Then I picked up my phone and called my father. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear noise behind him, voices overlapping, something playing in the background. It sounded like a full house. "Hey, Soph," he said, casual enough that it felt like any other call. "Everything okay? I was just checking what time you and Mom were coming over," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Dinner's ready." There was a pause, not long, but clear. "Tonight might not work," he said. "It's easier here with the kids. You know how that is." I leaned against the counter, looking at the plates I had already set out. "It's 30 minutes," I said. "You don't have to stay long." He let out a small breath, like I was making something simple more complicated. "We're in the same city. That counts," he said. Then, after a second, He added, "Your brother needs us more right now." I didn't respond right away. I let the sentence settle, the way it was meant to. "All right," I said finally. "I'll talk to you tomorrow." After I hung up, I stood in the quiet kitchen and listened to it for a moment. The food was still warm, the table still set, everything exactly as I had planned it, except for the part that mattered. It wasn't the cancellation itself that stayed with me. It was how easily it was explained away. By the third day, I stopped trying to keep things open-ended. I called my mother in the morning before work and said it plainly this time, without adjusting it to sound easier than it was. "I just need you to come over once," I said. "Not the whole evening. Just dinner. That's all." There was a quiet pause on her end, the kind that usually came before something softened into a non-answer. "That sounds nice," she said. "Let's see how the day goes. The kids have a few things planned, and your brother's juggling a lot." I didn't push it further. I had already said what I needed to say. That evening, I came home and started cooking anyway. Not because I believed they were coming, but because I didn't know what else to do with the space I had cleared for them. I kept everything simple, something that wouldn't take long to reheat if plans changed again, which by then felt likely. Around 7, while I was setting the table, my phone lit up with a notification. It was a post from my brother. I opened it without thinking, and there they were, all of them seated around a table at a restaurant I recognized. My parents were smiling. My brother had one arm around his youngest, and the caption read, "Family dinner. Wouldn't miss this for anything." I noticed he hadn't texted me once that week, not even to ask if I was coming. I stared at it longer than I expected to, not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because it confirmed something I had been trying not to name. I set my phone down and finished placing the last plate on the table. 4 settings, evenly spaced, everything in place. I stood there for a moment, looking at it, then pulled out my chair and sat down. The food was still warm. The room was quiet in a way that made every small sound more noticeable. The faint hum from the refrigerator, the soft scrape of the chair against the floor. I ate slowly, then packed the rest into containers I knew I wouldn't finish. I had cooked for 4 people. I was the only one there. That was the moment it stopped being about dinner. Once I stopped expecting them to show up, it became easier to see everything else more clearly. The week didn't feel like a separate event anymore. It felt like a continuation of something that had already been happening for a long time, just without the distance to soften it. I sat down at my kitchen table the next morning with my laptop open, not because I had planned to do anything specific, but because I needed to organize what I was thinking. That's usually how I handle things at work, and it felt easier to treat this the same way. At first, I just listed what I could remember. A few payments toward their mortgage when my father's work slowed down, covering my mother's prescriptions when she said insurance had become difficult to manage, sending money for my brother's childcare when something unexpected came up, which seemed to happen more often than it should have. None of it had felt like a decision at the time. It had just felt like the next reasonable step. I went back through my bank records to confirm the dates and amounts, not because I needed proof for anyone else, but because I wanted to see it without relying on memory. The numbers weren't extreme in any one instance, but taken together, they formed something steady, almost routine. I noticed how rarely it had been acknowledged. There were quick thank yous, usually followed by an explanation of why it had been necessary, but nothing that suggested it had mattered beyond the moment. I sat there longer than I meant to, looking at the list as it grew. It wasn't dramatic. It was consistent. The pattern became clear in a way it hadn't before. I made things easier, and in return, I became easier to overlook. When there was a choice to be made, they went where they were needed, or where it felt more natural, and I adjusted around it. I leaned back in my chair and closed the laptop halfway. Not fully, just enough to stop looking at it directly. I wasn't included. I was useful. And useful things don't get invited. They get used. I didn't wait for their trip to end before I made a decision. By that point, it didn't feel like something that needed more time. And I didn't need another missed plan to confirm what I already understood. I opened my banking app first and turned off the automatic transfer I had set up for my parents' expenses. It took less than a minute. I checked it twice anyway, just to be sure it wouldn't go through out of habit. After that, I logged into the accounts where my card was still saved and removed it, one by one, without rushing. There wasn't anything complicated about it. That was the part that stayed with me. I canceled the subscriptions that were under my name, the ones I had added over time, because it seemed easier than asking them to manage it themselves. Then I sent a short email to the childcare program my brother used, updating the billing information so future charges would go directly to the parent on file instead of me. I kept the message simple. I didn't explain anything beyond what was necessary. At one point, I paused with my hands resting on the keyboard, not because I wasn't sure, but because I realized how normal all of this had become before I stopped it. I wasn't ending a relationship, I said quietly to myself, more to hear it clearly than anything else. I was ending a system. I closed my laptop after that and sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle in around me. Nothing outside had changed yet, but I knew it would. The calls started early the next morning, before I had left for work. I saw my mother's name first, then my father's, then a message from my brother that came in right after. It wasn't chaotic, just steady, like something had been interrupted and needed to be fixed quickly. I let the first call go to voicemail and listened to it while I made coffee. My mother's voice was tight, controlled in a way that told me she was trying not to sound worried. "There's an issue with the pharmacy account," she said. "My card isn't going through. Can you check what happened? I didn't call her back right away." I sent a short message instead, letting her know I had removed my payment method and that she would need to update her own information. I kept it simple, without explanation. A few minutes later, my father called. I answered that one. "Sophia, we should talk this through," he said, his tone measured, like this was something that could be resolved with a conversation. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding." "It's not," I said. "I made some changes. You'll need to handle things on your end moving forward." There was a pause on the line, longer this time. "That's not how we usually do things," he said. "I know," I replied, and left it there. My brother's message came in while I was getting ready to leave. He didn't call. He wrote, "Childcare billing got flagged. Did something change?" I told him yes, that it had, and that the account needed to be updated. He didn't respond after that. By the time I got to my car, my phone was quiet again. No one had mentioned dinner. They reached out again on the last day of their visit, this time with more urgency than before. My father called in the afternoon, and when I answered, his tone had shifted into something closer to concern, though it still felt measured. "We should get together before we leave," he said. "Let's not end the trip like this." I leaned back in my chair, looking at the calendar on my desk, even though I already knew what I was going to say. "I'm not available tonight," I told him. There was a brief pause, followed by my mother's voice coming onto the line. She must have been sitting next to him. "Then come here," she said. "We're all at your brother's. It'll be easier." Easier. The word landed exactly where it had all week. "I'm not coming there," I said, keeping my voice even. "If you wanted to see me, you had time." "That's not fair," my father replied, more firmly now. "We're trying to fix this." I let that sit for a moment before answering. "You had 6 days to be my parents. I'm not making space on the 7th. I stayed where I was. I didn't open the door. No one spoke right away. I could hear movement on their end, something being set down, a door closing somewhere in the background. My mother tried again, softer this time. We didn't mean for it to feel this way." "I know," I said. "That doesn't change what happened." I ended the call after that, not abruptly, just without extending it. They didn't call back. For the first time that week, I wasn't waiting for them to. After they went home, things changed in ways that were quieter than I expected, but steady enough that I could see the difference. My father mentioned a week later that he had taken on additional consulting work. He said it in a practical tone, like it was something he had been meaning to do anyway. And I didn't challenge that. My mother told me she had switched her prescriptions to a different pharmacy that was more affordable, something I had suggested before but never pushed. At one point, my father said, "The house feels different without you helping." It wasn't quieter. It just felt like something was missing. He didn't explain what he meant, and I didn't ask. It wasn't just the money that had changed. It was what they were used to relying on. My brother didn't say much at first, but I heard through my mother that he had adjusted his childcare schedule. He had moved his youngest to a shorter program during the week and cut back on a few other expenses. There had been plans for a short trip later in the season, something with the kids. But that didn't happen. No one framed it as a consequence. They described it as adjusting. I didn't step in to fill any of the gaps. When my father mentioned the added work, I said I was glad things were coming together. When my mother talked about the pharmacy, I told her that sounded manageable. I kept my responses simple, without offering solutions. Around that time, I started spending more of my evenings outside the house. A colleague of mine, Olivia, invited me to dinner one night after work, and I said yes without thinking too much about it. We sat at a small table near the window, and for once, I wasn't checking my phone between conversations. It felt unfamiliar at first, not waiting for something to change. Then it felt easier than I expected. The week they visited stopped replaying in my head the way it had before. It stayed where it belonged. 3 months later, they came back to Charleston. This time, they paid for their own flights. They booked a small hotel downtown instead of staying with my brother, and my mother texted me a week in advance asking when I was available. The message was simple, but it was different in a way I didn't need to overanalyze. We settled on dinner at my place. I kept it straightforward, the same way I approached most things now. I cooked a meal that didn't take much effort, set the table for 3, and didn't add anything extra to make it feel like a moment it wasn't. When they arrived, they stood at the door for a second longer than usual before coming in, like they were waiting to see how they would be received. We sat down, and for a while, the conversation stayed on safe topics. My father asked about work, my mother commented on the apartment, and I answered without filling the silence too quickly. It wasn't uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. At one point, my mother set her fork down and looked at me directly. "I'm sorry," she said. "We should have come to see you. I know that now." She didn't add anything to it, and that mattered more than the words themselves. My father nodded, his voice quieter than I was used to. "We handled that week wrong." He said, "We shouldn't have assumed you'd just be fine with it." I let the moment sit without trying to fix it. "I appreciate you saying that," I told them. It was enough. After dinner, I cleared the table while they gathered their things. 3 plates, 3 glasses, nothing left waiting. I noticed it without thinking too much about it, just as a detail that made sense now. Before they left, my mother paused near the door, like she wanted to say something else, then didn't. That felt right too. I didn't think about it as a lesson at the time. I just stopped doing what I had been doing. If you keep making space for people who don't step into it, eventually that space stops belonging to you. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It just means you start choosing where your effort goes. If you've ever been the one who always adjusts, always makes it work, it's worth paying attention to what happens when you stop. I didn't stop being their daughter. I just stopped being their backup plan.